Hello everyone, my name is Derpenschnaff, but you may call me D, and today I'm going to teach you how I shade. Now there's a few ways I shade, but this is kind of my favorite version. It's the most easiest to digest, and there's a lot of ways to shade, so don't take this as gospel. There's so many ways to do it, so feel free to explore, don't just stick with this one. But I'm going to show you how to kind of shade body, because the way I shade fabrics and objects are a little different, but this is a great way to get the basics down because it's the hardest. So I'm starting off with two faces. One of them I'll show you how to do it, and the next one it'll be just a great example. We'll go through that one quite quickly just to reinforce it. I'm also going to show you how I shade with color, because you don't want to use black and whites when you're shading with color. So I have two different skin tones. This first one over here, it's a pinkish undertone. When you want skin tones, you're going to want pinks, oranges, and yellows to get the most natural. Now this one actually has more of a purple undertone, and the reason I did that is because a lot of times I shade my characters so they look sickly or they look kind of dead, and to do that I use green, blue, and purple as the undertone because it's not a natural undertone. For this to be natural, you want to use a red or an orange. So first, these layers are separate. The color and the line work is separate, so I can work freely without any problems. Layers is always the way to go. I highly recommend it if you're not doing it. At first, I always add more variation in the skin color before I ever shade. So since this has a pink and a reddish undertone, I would add flushed cheeks, and I would add in the skin tone like the lips and all that before I even start shading. It just works out very well, and I don't have to go back and worry about anything. So I usually use a very bright color because I'm going to adjust the opacity later. So we'll start out with the nose. That's a wrong brush. I've been flipping in between brushes, but I'm going to use this basic brush because this is what most people use. For this outline brush, I used a pencil brush. We're going to drop the opacity of that. There's many places where you can put it. It really depends on who it is. I usually add the nose, and I usually add some form of like triangle by the cheek, maybe like this or maybe like this. Today we're going to do this because it's the easiest. And then I also do the ears, so I'll just do it on the other side. Alright, so my shading is kind of a form of cell shading, and if you don't know what that is, that's usually what they use for cartoons where it's very crisp, there's not a lot of blending, it's a lot easier to do for me. And usually what I do here to make it fade, I take a very soft eraser and I kind of take the parts that I know won't be as flush or I don't want crisp edges on, and I just kind of blend it out with that. So for this one, the top of it and the middle of it won't be as red, and I'll add some definition. For the lips, the bottom and the edges won't be as defined, so I'll blend those out a little bit. And then for the ears, maybe I'll make the bottom less intense, and then I drop the opacity a bit, so it's just a mild undertone, and it adds just a little more realism to it. I could add a whole lot more. I usually do. I add some around here. Maybe I'll add some around the eyes. If I'm looking for a really tired character, I'll definitely add some under the eyes. It really depends on the ethnicity and just what type of character it is. Now for the shading, since again this has a red undertone, I'm going to use darker versions of red, and if I'm again looking for a more intense creepier feel, I'll use blue shadows because again that's more unnatural, but since I'm showing you a more natural look, I'm just going to use kind of very warm shadows for the skin. You do not want to use black for this, it will not look good. When you're doing color, you always want to use like a darker shade of a different color. For example, if you're shading white, you will use blue, and if you're shading black, it will start off as a gray and you can shade it with various blues. So here the light's going to come from here, so you got to think about where is the shadow going to come from. Well, there's a jawline here, so we're going to have a shadow here. I'm going to cast a very large one, and right now I'm just thinking of the darkest shadows because I work in steps, so the darkest shadows I always do first. and then the nose would be the second like most defining one, so we do the nose. And then maybe I'll shade this ear over here because it's completely hidden by the face. So you wouldn't see that at all. And then there might be like a very harsh shadow here if we're going very directly on the side. And now I do the same thing that I did with the flush. I take the soft eraser and I erase the edges so it kind of fades out a little bit. It's not as intense. So around this nose area, there would be a fade because the nose curves. And so I'd add a very slight fade there. And then this in general would be lighter. It's a lot of working in steps, just kind of feeling it out. And a lot of, when I was originally doing this, I did a lot of going back and redoing it and trying again. And then you just lower the opacity, and that's actually probably a little too gray. I'd actually want to make that a little more red because it doesn't look like a very good shadow, but that's the harshest shadows we'll probably use. And then I go in and I'll do the second harshest ones, which will shape the face and show which parts are deep. So if we're going to shape the face, we're going to go around this side. I usually go under the eye and over the eye. Depending on the ethnicity, it will change. If we're going to make this character Asian, we'll want right here to actually be a highlight. So we'll go like that. So you're going to want to contour the shaded side, you know, just add that there. And then since this area right here is deep, because these are kind of the veins in the neck and this is kind of a muscly part, this can kind of be deeper. So you're going to want to color that whole area in. When I go to the body, I will show how this part is very important. Shading in entire areas to show that it is deeper. It works very well for stomachs and chests, and it adds a lot of depth to the piece and makes it feel creepily human sometimes. And again, I go in with my brush. The chin's going to be lighter. This is going to be lighter. The forehead's probably going to be a little lighter. And then over here, it's going to go like that. And then you reduce the opacity a bit, and now it looks a bit shaded. And then usually I add a lot of minute details. I add a lot of layers. This is just 2. Sometimes I'll add 10. And sometimes it's something that you can barely notice, but since I add a lot of them, they look quite well. Now, if you want to get really in depth for the nose, I usually add some form of triangle here because there is a crease under your eye, and it's usually only defined in elderly people when it's cartoon style, but in my style I like to add it, and you blend it out in the end like this. It really depends. You can shade it in a lot of different ways, a lot of different triangles, and it's just kind of that bit of the nose that kind of tapers off into your skin. And usually there's some form of triangle under your eye, and it kind of creates that. If you're really having trouble with this, you can always look up other tutorials for face shapes and shading, but I also find that if I watch makeup tutorials, I can see how they're trying to shade their own face, and that can be helpful. And then for little details, you might add a little chin shade and all that, just lower the opacity a bunch, and it just adds tiny little details. And the face has a lot of those, so use a bunch of layers and then combine them. And that's how I would shade this. So now that we have the shading for this, I'm going to add some highlights. Now the highlights aren't going to be as crisp on this one because it's lighter. So I'd usually use a very light pink, but if they're very pale, you can just use white. And then I might do the under eye here, since there's a triangle there. Since we're going for more of a Asian look maybe, I would want to highlight that the eye is protruding outwards. You might want a little on the nose, just basic organic shapes. You don't want to use very harsh ones if you're wanting a soft light. If you're adding a very harsh light, you might want to do this and then go in and add in your very harsh, streaky highlights. You don't want your highlights to be very intense. A lot of shading styles don't even use highlights because the shading is a little more important. And then I usually go in with the eraser as well and adjust those slightly. So it just makes it pop just so slightly. Highlights should not be very crisp. I usually start with the softest highlights first, and then I add in the harsh ones. It's the opposite to what I do for shading. I usually do highlights last, and a lot of the time I may put them under the shadows, so the shadows are more prominent than the highlighting. Now for this one, I've already colored it. I'm gonna shade it and highlight it in blues, so it's not gonna look as natural. It's gonna look a little more sickly, but I'll do it really quick and you can see in how I usually do these things. And she's smiling, so I can add a little more details in the face, and just a way to learn, I guess. And I already added her undertones, which are purple and blue, so she kind of looks like an elf here because it's not very human. Alright, so here I am with this one. I basically did the same thing, just with different colors. I actually used purple for the highlights, so it actually looks like the color highlighting her, the light that is on her is colored a little bit. And then I went back at the end and I showed what it is like to add harsh lights to the face, where it's very reflective and it's very, very small. And it's not something that you want to cover her face in. And there's a little bit of abnormalities because it shows that the skin is not perfectly smooth and it makes her look a little less plastic. So that's how I do faces generally. It's a lot of practice with shapes. It's just basically bringing a lot of shape to the face, because without this it's pretty flat. So when you practice, you can use a mix of kind of rounded squares and circles and stuff. So here's a curve. The chin is a little square here. This is an oval. This was like a triangle, just very basic shapes. And it kind of creates a painted, look. And that's how I do it personally. There's other ways to do it, but if you like this way, practice it. And if you want to show me your faces that you do, you can show them to me in my Discord. So I have two bodies here. I have a female and a male because I want to show you how this one's going to be a little more soft and this one's going to be a little more crisp. And I gave them two different undertones. This one's actually a little too pink, so it's again a little unnatural, just slightly. It actually looks odd because it looks like his skin is almost see-through. It has almost no pigment in it. Once you go beyond into the purples, that's when you get into a very unnatural because it's gone beyond see-through. It's not realistic. This one has a very orangey undertone. It doesn't feel see-through. You feel like you're looking at a very warm skin tone. So again, I'm going to add the undertones. I'm going to start with the female, and I'll show you how that works, and then I'll go to the male and I'll do that one quickly, just like I did last time. So I'm going to add more orangey undertones on this one because she has more of an orange undertone. The places you want to add undertones on the body are places that would be flush. So for example, your cheeks are flush. That's where a lot of blood shows through. Places that have creases or are rubbed up against things often. The knees, you would definitely want to add some color to because they get roughed up a lot and they just appear more red. It really depends on your character. If you have a paler character that's maybe a ginger, you might want to add some in their shoulders, their elbows, and maybe their hips because they have very sheer skin and or they get sunburn a lot, and those are the places that get sunburned. So places that have more damage will have more pigment in them. Usually places like here, you wouldn't add pigment, but places that are over here would have pigment. For example, also here, places that are down like the collarbone, I wouldn't really add it there, but I would add it to shoulders. It's a lot of getting used to. If you want to know just where to add it, just add it towards the places that are kind of round and going outward. That's what looks best for me. I wouldn't ever really add some weird pigment here. It just doesn't look very nice. You want to emphasize the round bits. So I'll just add some here as well, just to show how that would look. And I'm actually going to show you a little shading after this that I didn't show in the faces, but I use very often, and it's very subtle, so don't go crazy with it. I think that's all I'm going to do for this one. I'm not going to go crazy with the undertones. Usually I get very in depth with this part because it adds so much color to the skin and it makes it look a lot more alive. But again, when you're doing this subtlety, you don't want big orange spots on your person because it's gonna look like they have weird skin problems. So that'll be fine for this. Now, the thing that I didn't show is I do this very broad shading. Basically adds a huge, very soft shadow onto the person. So again, let's say the light is coming from here. Wrong brush again. I'm going to add a very large shadow that covers almost the entire thing. And it's going to add only a little bit on the side that isn't covered in it. And I'll fade this out with a soft eraser, and I'll show you why I do it. It just makes it look a lot better. Alright, so here it is. Not the prettiest, but then I take this out and I use a bigger one, and then I just fade it out, and then I use that as like an undershade. So when I put the harsher and more crisp shades on top like I did with the face, it just gives it a little more depth because this side is more shaded than that side. And then I add in the sharp ones, which is very similar to the face. I will take the shaded side and I will just kind of touch that up. And then I will add it to the creases as well because creases make shadows. And I usually use triangles and all sorts of that stuff. This belly button would be shaded in. I would add maybe a tiny bit with this line. Under the breasts would be very shaded. They cast large shadows since these are especially large breasts as well. And when doing this, you want to just think about what is casting a shadow, basically. And under here would be a shadow because it is under her. So those are my very harshest shadows that I would get, and then I would fade them out a bit. This would be the most intense because there's a larger shadow here, and as we get up here, we're starting to get away from that shadow, less away from the breast and under here, so more light would hit it, and so there would be less of a shadow. So like the tips of shadows would usually be less intense. So those are my harshest shadows. And then just like with the neck, I would do that with here. I'm actually only going to do the top because she's going to be kind of skinnier towards the top and she's going to have a little bit of a fupa. So we'll do just a little bit up here and we'll make it curved just to emphasize that rib cage. And then down here, we'll do a very similar thing. And you just kind of want to fill in that area. And then we'll take this. It's lighter when it's pointing towards the light. And then usually I take away this inner part so this line here looks way more crisp and defining. So when we take that out, it makes her appear skinnier up here. So this part and this part are depressed. And so this part is looking more outward. So before all of this, it kind of looked pretty flat. And when we added this, her rib cage is out, it goes inward, her fupa comes out, and then it goes inward and out again. And then there's a lot of places you can add this. It really depends on, again, what body type you want your character to have. I might add some right here if they're really skinny and I want to emphasize that that their skin and their chest plate are really pressed up against each other. I can do that. It just really depends on what type of body type you want to give your character. It's very similar to the face. And then again, I would go under the shading and then I would add the highlights. And for this one, I'm going to use white, just in the places where it really hits the most. And it'll make everything just pop a little more with very, very subtle highlights. Now I'm going to shade this one real quick. I won't really talk over it. You can just watch and see how I would do this one. This one had more organic shapes. This one's going to be very crisp. And it's just to reinforce what I just talked about. Alright, so that's what I've got for this shading. I hope that you learned a lot from this tutorial. I don't know how concise I am at explaining these things, especially since a lot of these are quite abstract, but let me know if it helped or what else you want. You can ask me questions in my Discord or the comments and I will answer them to my best abilities. But if you liked it, please leave a like and subscribe because I do tutorials and I do other artworks and I think watching is the best way to learn. So other than that, I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye! But it's too late now, I remember you and me and how careless we